problem here is that if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And we need to learn that sometimes laws and attitudes have been legislated, if you will, that aren't based on reality. You know, it was kind of like putting the Japanese in camps at the beginning of World War II, visiting the sins of the fathers or grandfathers or great-grandfathers on the offspring. There was no good reason for that. But it sounded good, seemed reasonable. Let's do it. It's something we can do because we have the power and they don't. And so the examples are legion, and you wonder in how many other areas we're doing similar things. That is, jumping to conclusions. Somebody is different, therefore they're inferior, and, you know, that is distressing, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no kidding. Well, I mean, I think it happens all the time. You know, I'm looking at the clock, and there's a few topics that I so want to hit. And so I want to kind of shift yet again, because in the book you kind of talk, I call them alternatives, you know, and, you know, from more mainstream science to more alternative science, which, you know, we're all kind of in that same boat. We're like, I consider us all alternatives, even though we can, like, ride the mainstream if we want to, put on our good clothes. In the section that talked about, I don't know, I didn't write down what the section. I'm just going to say, in one of the sections in the beginning, you talk about, and I guess, Stan, this was your part, you talk about, and I'm going to say, astrology. I'm going to put the alternative word on it because it was not said in the book, where you talk about the position of the planets and the Earth magnetic field and the effect it has on human behavior. Now, when you talk about alternatives, it's like if you say astrology, it's like, yeah, I read my horoscope and that's a bunch of crap. But it sounds like science maybe kind of believes it.
There are some scientists who have kept an open mind and done an enormous amount of work. Dr. Robert O. Becker, who was nominated for a Nobel Prize, did some wonderful work on determining the effects of electric and magnetic fields on people. Now, part of this came from studying the fact that certain animal living creatures, I'll call it that, can regenerate the limbs if you cut them off. Now, you and I can't do that. So we started looking at the effects of electric and magnetic fields on regeneration, and then on broken bones that wouldn't heal, and got very positive results, and found that there was more to this. We are the body electric is the name of his book. And one of the places this came up, if you want to, let's throw in that dirty word astrology, you know, and every astronomer in the audience cringes, but the kicker is a true astrologer does not say, you know, read the newspaper, you're one of 12 groups of people, that'll tell you what's going to happen. What they recognize is that people learned a long time ago there were certain features in common of people born at about the same time. Now, one of the things that intrigued me way back when, more than 30 years ago, actually 40 years ago, there was a guy named Nelson from RCA whose job it was to predict when they would have to use landlines to transmit radio signals because the atmosphere, something was going wrong and radio signals just wouldn't get through. And he was very expert at predicting the times. It cost money to use landlines, so they wanted to use radio waves. The way he did this was he found out that you could correlate the ease of transmission with the position of the planets. Now, that sounds crazy to most people because, after all, there's no connection between, say, Jupiter and you and me, right?
Of course not.
Not quite right. There's an intermediary reaction, if you will. He found out that the position of the planets, and this is quite straightforward, influences the gravitational field at the surface of the sun. And, the two biggest planets being on one side gives you a different result than if one's on one side and one's on the other side of the sun. The center of gravity of the sun is not in the center of the sun. It's determined by where the planets are. And it appears that changes in the center of gravity of the sun trigger solar storms. These, in turn, send huge amounts of energy to the Earth. And they can have bad effects like interrupting power, and this has happened a few times, and we're worried now with satellites being susceptible to electric and magnetic particles and waves and all this stuff from the sun. And it appears that Becker, being a very curious man and finding the effects of electric and magnetic fields on people and wound healing and stuff, also looked at, he was at a veterans hospital in Syracuse, so he had access to a lot of data. He looked at admissions to mental hospitals as a function of the Earth's electric and magnetic field parameters, and amazingly discovered that there was a connection. When there was a change in the electric field, let's say, the admissions went up. And he had nurses in mental wards keep track of patients on, 6-8 hour periods and their overall behavior, and then check with what the magnetic fields and electric fields were. And son of a gun, there was a connection. And again, I believe it's related to the electric and magnetic fields from the sun producing particles which interact with the Earth and the atmosphere. And there were papers written 50 years ago saying electromagnetism has no place in what happens in the solar system. It's entirely gravity. Related to this, we got into climate change, so-called. It turns out that we used to think, quite incorrectly, that the sun was constant in its output of energy. We have a term called the solar constant, how much energy is emitted by the sun per second per square meter, that kind of thing. It's a constant. Well, it turns out, once we got above the atmosphere and could study these things very much more detail and carefully, that electric and magnetic fields are enormously important in the solar system. The Van Allen belts are an example of that. And I point out that Immanuel Velikovsky was soundly denounced for suggesting that electric and magnetic fields might be important. And he predicted that there would be radiation from the equivalent of Van Allen belts around Jupiter. Nobody believed him. It was discovered by accident. Ooh, boy, was there a lot of magnetic field effect. And so we've been dragged sort of struggling hand and foot into the 21st century, where we now recognize, A, that the sun's output is variable, B, that has an effect on the weather via the solar storms, and that we better be looking more carefully, because our world is much more sensitive, if you will, to the electric and magnetic fields. Satellites can be knocked out by these solar storms, and we're dependent on satellites for military communications, GPS, all kinds of things. So, you can say, oh, he's just talking about astrology. It's a lot more complicated than that. And people who are careful in doing their research and in looking up what has been done, instead of making pronouncements from on high, are finding that this is an area of concern. 2 new satellites are sending down wonderful data about the sun, which is not constant. And this gets over to the anthropogenic global warming, man-induced. It appears that Mother Nature is the problem, not man. That the temperatures have been higher when there was no CO2 practically speaking, being produced by man. It's a long story. But this is an area, in other words, that has implications. The global warming people want us, the rich countries, to spend, $600 or $800 billion to help the poor countries get things in line so they don't suffer the terrible consequences of what we Western countries are doing by putting out so much of this evil CO2, even though the temperatures have been higher.